Hello and welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive.
Great to be here.
Okay, so today, you, our fantastic learner audience, have given us a whole bunch of really interesting sources, all circling around this big topic of learning English.
That's right. A real mix of stuff to get into.
Yeah, things like, the common problems people run into, the best ways to actually learn effectively, and that huge factor, motivation.
Absolutely. So our plan today is to really unpack all of that.
Exactly. We want to pull out the key ideas, connect the dots between these different sources, and hopefully make it all clear, maybe even a bit engaging.
Hopefully. And useful, most importantly. Useful for your own learning.
Precisely. Immediately useful. So where are we drawing from today? What's in the mix?
Well, we've got some very practical insights on common mistakes from CEC, that's Cork English College. Real hands-on experience there.
Okay, good grounding.
Then we've got a more academic angle with a paper called Accelerating English Language Learning. This is from Shant Eric Khazar at the University of Toronto's Education Institute, ISET.
Right, so that'll likely dig into the how and why a bit more.
Exactly. It looks at things like memory, different tools and techniques, the influence of your first language, your L1, and of course, the role of technology in learning.
Technology, always a big one. What else?
We're also looking at language learning methods more broadly, drawing from an article by Take Mexico. And then there's a fascinating piece of research on immersion education.
Immersion, like jumping in at the deep end.
Sort of, yeah. It's a rapid evidence assessment, actually commissioned by the Welsh government, looking at what works in immersion settings. That was done by IF and Cardiff Metropolitan University.
Wales. Interesting context.
Very. And then we've got some very practical advice on pronunciation from Educapes. How to actually sound clearer.
Oh, that's crucial. Pronunciation can be a real hurdle.
Definitely. And finally, we're rounding it off with a study on motivation, specifically looking at English as a foreign language from the University Ahmed Draya Adrar in Algeria, comparing online versus in-person learning motivation.
Wow, okay, so a really wide range of perspectives, from practical college advice to academic papers, government reports, specific skills like pronunciation, and the psychology of motivation.
It's a rich tapestry, as you said earlier. Lots to weave together.
Right, so the plan is walk through it all, highlight the bits that really matter for you, the learner. We'll start with those common mistakes, figure out how to sidestep them, then look at strategies to speed things up, how your native language fits in, the tech angle.
And wrap up with motivation, especially thinking about different ways people learn online, face-to-face, that kind of thing.
Perfect. Okay, then let's dive in, kicking things off with those common errors that the Cork English College flagged. Where do learners often trip up first?
Well, one of the big ones they highlighted, and it's no surprise really, is prepositions.
Ah, yes. Those tiny little words, in, on, at, for, with. They can be a nightmare, can't they?
They really can. And the reason they're so tricky, as CEC points out, is that their usage often just doesn't translate logically from one language to another.
Right. You can't just think, okay, in my language we use this word here, so I'll use the English equivalent. Doesn't work like that.
Exactly. Think about phrases like interested in something or good at something.
Yeah.
The specific preposition choice is idiomatic. It's just the way English speakers say it.
And if you get it wrong, if you say, I don't know, interested on politics or good in playing guitar.
Well, a native speaker would instantly know what you mean, probably, but
Yeah.
just it sounds off, unnatural.
Okay, so it affects fluency, makes you sound less like a native speaker.
It definitely can. And sometimes, yeah, it can actually change the meaning, or at least create ambiguity. Getting on, in, and at right for time and place is a classic example. It requires learning the specific contexts.
So what's the advice then? How do you get the hang of these tricky little words?
CEC suggests a few practical things. One is to actively study common prepositional phrases, those chunks of language that frequently go together.
Like depend on, listen to, wait for, that kind of thing.
Precisely. Learn them as whole units, not just isolated words. They also suggest using things like flashcards.
Old school, but effective.
Can be, yeah. Especially for drilling those fixed phrases. Maybe write the phrase on one side and an example sentence on the other.
Good idea. What else?
The really crucial thing, they emphasize, is practice. Especially practicing with native speakers if possible, or at least paying close attention to how prepositions are used naturally.
So, listening carefully, watching movies, reading books.
Exactly. Immerse yourself. Notice the patterns. Don't just focus on the big words. Pay attention to little connecting words, too. Over time, you start to develop a better feel for what sounds right.
It's about internalizing the patterns rather than just memorizing rules that might have tons of exceptions anyway.
That's a big part of it, developing that intuition.
Okay, that makes sense for prepositions. What was the second common mistake they flagged?
This one's about speaking. It's the overuse of fillers.
Fillers, you mean like,
You know, exactly those. We all use them sometimes. Even native speakers, it's natural in conversation to pause and think.
Sure, gives you a second to gather your thoughts.
Right. But the issue CEC points out is when learners rely on them too much, especially when they're maybe searching for a word or trying to structure a sentence.
It becomes a crutch.
It can, yeah. And if it's happening constantly, it can make your speech sound quite hesitant, maybe unclear, and it can be a bit distracting for the listener.
I can see that. It might give the impression you're less confident or less fluent than you actually are just because of those filler sounds.
That's a potential perception, yes. So the advice here is pretty direct.
Which is?
Consciously try to reduce them. Become aware of when and how often you're using them.
How do you even notice, though? It feels pretty automatic sometimes.
Recording yourself speaking is a great way. It can be a bit revealing.
I bet. Cringy, maybe.
Maybe a little, but incredibly useful. Or practicing with a language partner who can gently point it out.
Okay, so awareness first. Then what?
Try replacing the filler with a brief, silent pause. Just take a breath, collect your thoughts, and then continue. It often sounds much more controlled and fluent than filling the gap with or
Okay, pause instead of fill. That's a concrete technique.
And another tip they give is to prepare a little for common topics. If you know you might be asked about your job or your hobbies or your weekend, think beforehand about some key things you might want to say.
Practice responses, essentially.
Yeah. Having some ideas and vocabulary ready means you're less likely to be caught searching for words and reaching for those fillers.
So preparation builds confidence, reduces the need for fillers. Makes sense. These seem like really practical starting points from CEC. Watch the prepositions, cut down on the ums and uhs.
Simple concepts, but they can make a noticeable difference in clarity and sounding more natural.
Right. Okay, so let's transition now. We've talked about avoiding common pitfalls. What about actively speeding up the learning process? This brings us to that academic paper by Khazar, Accelerating English Language Learning.
Yes, this paper dives much deeper into the cognitive side of things and how we can leverage certain principles and tools to learn more efficiently.
Where does Khazar start? What's the foundation?
They start with the basics of memory, which is fundamental to all learning, obviously. They talk about the difference between working memory and long-term memory.
Okay, break that down a bit. Working memory is like RAM in a computer, short-term holding.
That's a pretty good analogy, yeah.
Yeah.
It's where you actively process new information, hold things in your mind temporarily while you're thinking or working on a task, but it's limited in capacity.
And long-term memory is the hard drive, where things get stored more permanently.
Exactly. That's where well-learned information resides, stuff you can retrieve relatively easily when you need it. And Khazar emphasizes that the whole point of effective learning is moving information from that temporary working memory into stable long-term memory.
Making it stick, basically.
Making it stick and making it accessible.
So how do we do that more effectively? What does Khazar suggest for accelerating that transfer?
One of the key techniques highlighted in the paper is the use of spaced repetition systems, or SRS.
SRS. Okay, I've heard of this. It's used in apps like Anki and things like that, right?
Precisely. Those are popular examples. The core idea behind SRS is based on how our memory naturally works, specifically the forgetting curve.
The forgetting curve. We naturally forget things over time unless we review them.
Exactly, and SRS leverages this. It's built on the principle that while repeated exposure helps us remember things, spaced repetition is far more effective than massed repetition.
So reviewing something 5 times spread out over a week is better than reviewing it 20 times all in one night before a test.
Massively better for long-term retention, yes. That 20 times in one night approach is cramming. And while it might get you through the test tomorrow, a lot of that information will likely vanish soon after.
Right. I think we've all experienced that.
Yeah.
So how does SRS actually space the repetition?
It uses algorithms. When you learn a new item, say a vocabulary word, the system tests you on it later. If you remember it easily, the interval before you see it again gets longer.
Okay.
But if you struggle to remember it or forget it, the system shows it to you again much sooner. It adapts the review schedule based on your performance with each specific item.
So it focuses your effort on the things you're weakest on, just as you're about to forget them.
That's the optimal time, yes. Reviewing just before you forget strengthens the memory trace much more efficiently than reviewing something you already know well or something you've completely forgotten.
That sounds incredibly efficient. Does Khazar mention specific evidence for SRS in language learning?
Yes. The paper cites studies showing that using SRS significantly improved vocabulary retention for English language learners compared to more traditional study methods. It helps systematically move those words into long-term memory.
So applying that to the preposition issue earlier, you could make SRS flashcards for tricky phrases like interested in or depend on.
Absolutely. That would be a perfect application. Actively recalling the phrase at spaced intervals would really help solidify it.
Interesting. Okay, SRS is one powerful tool. What else does Khazar discuss in terms of accelerating learning, particularly regarding technology?
Yeah, Khazar is quite positive about the potential of technology more broadly. Not just SRS, but various tools that can increase student engagement and potentially improve retention as well.
What kinds of tools are we talking about?
Several examples are mentioned. One is Prezi, the presentation software.
Right, the one that zooms around instead of linear slides.
Yeah. Khazar observed that using Prezi, possibly because of its visual, nonlinear, mind map-like structure, seemed to increase engagement and retention, particularly with ELO students in science and biology classes.
Maybe it just grabs attention more? Less passive than watching slides go by.
That could be part of it. The visual mapping of information might also aid comprehension and recall for some learners.
Okay, what other tech examples?
Computer-mediated reading programs. There's research suggesting these can help improve long-term vocabulary retention, especially for intermediate learners.
How do they work, typically? Do they provide definitions or context clues as you read?
Often, yes. They might offer clickable definitions, translations, example sentences, or other scaffolds to support comprehension while reading authentic texts. The studies mentioned suggest they can also boost motivation for reading.
But you said especially intermediate learners. What about beginners?
Khazar notes that beginners might not get the same level of benefit initially. Perhaps the texts are still too challenging, or they need more foundational knowledge first. It highlights that tech isn't a magic wand. It needs to be appropriate for the learner's level.
Right, context matters. Any other specific tech tools?
Tagging systems for reading. This involves students actively identifying key themes or concepts in a text and tagging them, sometimes collaboratively.
So it forces active engagement with the meaning, not just passive reading.
Exactly. The idea is it improves reading efficiency and deeper comprehension by making learners process the information more actively.
Interesting. Almost like highlighting, but more structured and possibly collaborative.
Sort of, yes. And another one mentioned is Bitstrips, the online comic creator.
Comics. How does that help language learning?
The interesting angle Khazar notes is the word limits. Because you can only fit so much text in a speech bubble or caption, it forces students to be concise and choose their vocabulary carefully, focusing on the most essential words to convey meaning.
An unintentional vocabulary focusing tool. Clever.
And finally, interactive whiteboards get to mention the potential for visual engagement and interactivity improving learning, using citation activities as an example.
Okay, so a common thread seems to be engagement, visual elements, interactivity, making learning less passive.
I think that's a fair summary of the potential benefits Khazar sees in these technologies. But they also had a crucial point about classroom management.
Which is?
The need for clear policies on how technology is used. Is it for translation? Research only. Preventing it from just becoming a distraction is key, especially in a classroom setting.
Absolutely. Managing the tool effectively is as important as the tool itself. Okay, so technology offers potential acceleration. Khazar's paper also talks about something else crucial, the transfer of knowledge from our first language, L1, to the second language, L2. English in this case.
Yes, this is a huge area.
Yeah.
How does what we already know in our native tongue affect how we learn English? Khazar highlights phonological production, basically, pronunciation and sounds, as a major area of transfer.
Transferring our accent, essentially.
It's more fundamental than just accent, though that's part of it. It's about how our brain is wired to perceive and produce the specific sounds of our L1. This can be positive. If the sounds are similar in English, it gives you a head start.
Like maybe Spanish speakers find certain English vowel sounds easier than, say, Japanese speakers might, because Spanish has similar vowels.
Potentially, yes. But it can also be negative transfer, or interference, where sounds exist in English but not in your L1, or vice versa, or where similar sounds are pronounced slightly differently. This can make perception and production really challenging. Khazar mentions the universal phonology principle, highlighting how deeply ingrained our L1 sound system is.
So our ears and mouths are kind of tuned to our first language.
Very much so, from a very early age. But Khazar doesn't just see this as a barrier. They argue we can actively leverage the L1. By understanding the similarities, especially in cognitive elements like phonology or even some grammatical concepts, we can build on the L1 foundation, rather than trying to ignore it or build English entirely from scratch. Make connections.
Okay, so use the L1 as a resource, not just an obstacle. What about translation? Lots of learners translate in their heads, right?
Khazar acknowledges this is very common, especially initially, as a way to grasp meaning. Students often mentally translate new English words back to their L1.
Is that helpful or harmful?
It's a bit of both. It can be a useful scaffold at the start, but relying on it too heavily for too long can hinder fluency. It slows you down, prevents you from thinking in English, and can lead to awkward phrasing if the grammar is different, which it often is.
Right, you end up speaking English with the grammar of your first language.
Potentially, yes. So it's a tool to be used judiciously, perhaps, rather than as the primary strategy long-term.
Got it. Khazar also stresses cultural understanding, going beyond just words and grammar.
Absolutely crucial. Language doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's embedded in culture, norms, customs, politeness levels, humor, slang, colloquialisms.
Things that aren't in the dictionary.
Often not, no. And misunderstanding these can lead to communication breakdowns or even unintentional offense, even if your grammar is perfect. Cultural competence is key for truly effective communication.
Can you give an example?
Well, levels of directness vary hugely across cultures. What's considered polite and indirect in one culture might seem evasive or unclear in another. What's seen as friendly and informal in one might be perceived as disrespectful in another. Understanding these nuances is vital.
And this relates to academic skills, too. Khazar mentioned paraphrasing and referencing.
Yes, a fascinating point. In some cultures, accurately quoting an authority or a memorized text is highly valued as a sign of respect and diligence.
Whereas in many Western academic contexts, that would be seen as plagiarism if not properly cited, right?
Yeah.
We emphasize putting things in your own words.
Exactly. So for learners coming from those backgrounds, learning the conventions of paraphrasing, summarizing, and citing sources in the expected academic style is a significant cultural and academic adjustment. Khazar suggests technology can actually help teach these citation skills.
That's a really important nuance. It's not just about language proficiency, but also academic culture proficiency.
Precisely. And finally, Khazar circles back to vocabulary acquisition.
The foundation of everything.
Pretty much. Khazar reiterates that you can't really accelerate your overall English proficiency reading, writing, listening, speaking without continuously building your vocabulary. Repeated exposure to words and context is essential for them to stick.
Which brings us back to things like reading widely, using SRS, maybe those computer-mediated reading programs.
All contribute to that crucial goal of vocabulary growth. It's presented as a cornerstone of accelerated learning.
Okay, Khazar's paper gives us a lot to think about. Memory, SRS, tech, L1 transfer, culture, vocabulary. Really comprehensive. Now, let's shift to the NATIC Mexico article. This one seems more focused on practical strategies, combining different methods.
Yes, NATIC takes a very down-to-earth approach. Their core message is, learning English takes hard work and dedication, yes, but you also need a smart strategy that mixes different tools and approaches.
No single magic method.
Pretty much. They argue that combining methods is usually the most effective way to make steady progress and avoid getting stuck in a rut.
What methods do they compare?
They look at three main ones: online classes, textbooks, grammar guides, and language exchange partners.
Okay, let's take online classes first. We touched on this with Khazar, but what's NATIC's take on the pros and cons?
Advantages they highlight include the huge variety of teachers and classes available now. You can find specialists, different teaching styles, group classes, one-on-one, loads of choice.
And flexibility, presumably. Learn from anywhere, anytime.
Big advantage, yes. Flexibility in scheduling. Plus, many platforms have interactive exercises, quizzes, maybe multimedia resources built in, which can help keep things engaging.
Sounds good. Downsides.
The main one they mention is the lack of that direct in-person interaction. You miss the physical presence of the teacher and classmates, the spontaneous conversation, the social aspect of a classroom.
Which some people really thrive on. So when are online classes most useful? according to Nautic?
They suggest they're great for beginners to get started and also really good for people with busy schedules who need that flexibility.
Makes sense.
They also say online can be very useful for intermediate and advanced learners too, provided it's combined with other methods and, crucially, real-life practice.
Ah, so not just online lessons in isolation.
Right. They specifically warn that relying only on apps or passive online learning might lead you to hit a plateau. You need active use and real communication.
Okay, that echoes Khazar and the need for active engagement. What about the old faithfuls? Textbooks and grammar guides? Still relevant.
Nautic says yes, definitely still valuable. Their big strength is providing those in-depth, systematic explanations of grammar rules and sentence structures.
For people who like to understand the why behind the language, the analytical learners.
Exactly. They're great for building that foundational understanding of how the language is put together. Good for studying outside of class, consolidating knowledge. They'd even note some people have managed to learn languages quite well, primarily from books.
Really? Just from books? That takes dedication.
It certainly does. The potential disadvantage, of course, is that textbooks alone can be a bit dry or less engaging than more interactive methods. They provide structure, but maybe not as much dynamism.
Okay, so good for the framework, maybe combined with something more interactive. Which brings us to the third method, language exchange partners.
Yes, finding someone to practice speaking with.
What are the big pluses here?
Huge advantages for conversational practice. You get exposed to natural, everyday language, slang, idioms, how people really talk.
Stuff you don't find in textbooks.
Often, no. Plus, it's a chance for cultural immersion, getting insights into how people think and live. And you get immediate feedback on your mistakes in a real conversation.
That sounds ideal. Are there downsides?
There can be, yeah. It can feel intimidating, especially at first. Speaking with a native speaker when you're not confident can be nerve-wracking.
I can imagine.
Finding a good, reliable partner can also be a challenge. Matching schedules, learning goals, personalities, and practice might be inconsistent if one person is less committed than the other.
So, potentially amazing, but requires effort to set up and maintain, and maybe some courage to start.
That sums it up well. High potential reward, but requires finding the right situation and overcoming potential initial hesitation.
So, Nautic's overall message is mix and match. Find a blend that works for you.
Pretty much. Combine the flexibility and resources of online learning, the structural foundation from textbooks, and the real-world practice from language exchange or other forms of interaction. Tailor your strategy.
Don't put all your eggs in one basket.
Exactly. Find a balanced approach that suits your style, goals, and keeps you motivated.
Right. Okay, that's a very practical perspective. Now let's shift to something a bit more specific. That research on immersion education from the Welsh government report. Even if someone isn't in a full immersion school, are there takeaways here?
I think so, definitely. Understanding the principles of effective immersion can help anyone trying to create a more immersive environment for themselves. This report reviewed a lot of literature on what works.
What were some key findings? They mentioned targeting linguistic competence.
Yes. And one interesting strategy they highlighted was using bilingual storybooks.
Books with the story in two languages.
Exactly. They cited a study in Bangladesh where using books in both the classroom language and the children's home languages significantly improved literacy outcomes.
So using the home language actually helped them learn the classroom language better. That seems counterintuitive for immersion.
It does. But it ties back to Khazar's point about leveraging the L1. Building on that known foundation can provide strong support for learning the L2. The L1 isn't the enemy, it's a resource.
Okay, that's a recurring theme. What else on linguistic competence?
They mentioned a reading intervention using technology. This program provided vocabulary help that explicitly bridged English words to the learner's L1, Spanish, in the study cited.
Making direct connections again. Did it work?
It seemed to improve vocabulary acquisition, yes. Again, reinforcing that idea of leveraging the L1, though they noted it was hard to pinpoint exactly which feature of the tech program was most effective because it had multiple components.
Fair enough. What about classroom strategies in immersion settings?
Again, consciously leveraging the L1 comes up teachers explicitly showing links between the target language and the learner's first language.
Okay.
They also described a specific model used in an Arizona school called the 2-1-L2 model. This involves structured time blocks. 30 minutes of English immersion, 30 minutes of Spanish immersion, the home language, and then 30 minutes of translanguaging.
Translanguaging, what's that exactly?
It basically means allowing and encouraging students to use all their linguistic resources, both languages fluidly, to make meaning, communicate, and learn. not keeping the languages strictly separate.
So mixing languages strategically, did that help?
The report suggested it increased the students' confidence in using both languages. It validates their entire linguistic repertoire.
That sounds quite progressive. It challenges the English-only idea sometimes found in language teaching.
It does. And related to this, the report mentioned findings that using the L1 as a medium of instruction for some subjects can actually benefit L2 acquisition in the long run. A strong foundation in L1 literacy and concepts supports L2 development.
Wow, okay. And code switching in books.
Yeah, using children's books, mainly in the home language, but strategically inserting key vocabulary from the target language. This was found to support vocabulary acquisition better for bilingual learners than books written only in the target language.
It's like scaffolding the new words within a familiar context. Really interesting.
It is. It shows very nuanced ways of using the L1 supportively within an overall immersion goal.
What about the teachers in these settings?
The report stressed the need for specific training in immersion methodologies. Teachers need to know how to teach content through a second language effectively, how to differentiate instruction based on learners' varying language levels.
It's not just about being fluent in the target language yourself.
No, it's a specific pedagogical skill set.
Yeah.
Knowing how much target language to use, when to scaffold, how to make input comprehensible. Flexible grouping of students was also mentioned as helpful.
And what about learners with additional learning needs, ALN? Does immersion work for them?
That's a really important question addressed in the report. They found that specific vocabulary interventions are crucial for ALN learners in immersion.
What kind of interventions?
Things like explicit definitions, lots of repetition, using visual and gestural cues, creating real communication opportunities, and making semantic connections linking new words to known concepts. Interactive discussions were also highlighted as beneficial.
So more intensive, targeted support.
Exactly. And interestingly, translanguaging was mentioned again here as a potentially fairer way to assess ALN learners, allowing them to show what they know using all their languages.
Rather than penalizing them if their target language skills are still developing?
Precisely. The report also mentioned that small group instruction can be very effective for students with reading difficulties and dual immersion, and that mixing monolingual and multilingual learners in groups can actually benefit everyone's linguistic development. Teacher training and scaffolding is key here too.
So even from the specific world of immersion, we get these broader themes. Leverage the L1, use interactive and varied strategies, differentiate for learners' needs, and the importance of teacher training. Lots of relevant ideas.
Definitely. Many transferable principles.
Okay, let's zoom in on a specific skill now. Pronunciation. The advice from Educapes on speaking clearly. This is something many learners worry about a lot.
Understandably so. You can know a lot of grammar and vocabulary, but if people can't understand you easily, communication breaks down. Educapes has a very practical focus here.
What's their main point?
They argue for focusing on what's most important for intelligibility, rather than trying to achieve a perfect native accent, which is often unrealistic and unnecessary. And for them, the key element is stress.
Stress, you mean emphasizing the right syllable in a word and the right words in a sentence?
Exactly. Word stress and sentence stress. English is a stress-timed language, and getting the stress patterns wrong is often more detrimental to being understood than slightly mispronouncing an individual sound.
Okay, focus on stress. How do they suggest integrating this into teaching, say, in a grammar class?
They suggest making pronunciation a regular part of grammar lessons, not just an afterthought. For instance, introduce new grammar points orally, modeling the natural pronunciation and stress.
So students hear it correctly from the start.
Yes. And have students read practice sentences aloud. Don't just check the grammar's right. Listen for the flow, the thought groups, and whether they're stressing the important content, words, nouns, main verbs, adjectives, adverbs.
Making the meaning clear through stress.
Precisely. They also emphasize focusing on crucial final sounds, like the S, Z for plurals and third-person verbs, and the T, D, deed sounds for past tense endings. These carry grammatical meaning, so getting them right aids comprehension.
Good point. Small sounds, big grammatical impact.
Definitely. And they really hammer home how sentence stress changes meaning. Their example, I ordered 2 hamburgers, not 1 or 3, versus I ordered 2 hamburgers, not pizzas.
The emphasis completely changes the implication.
Totally. So teach contrastive stress explicitly when explaining grammar or correcting errors. Make learners aware of how moving the stress changes the focus.
These are great tips for integrating pronunciation naturally. What about specific practice activities?
One activity is to give students sentences with different stress patterns marked, read them aloud, and have students identify which words were stressed. Trains their listening.
Ear training for stress.
Exactly. And another really good one is mirroring.
Mirroring, like shadowing.
Very similar. Students listen to a recording of a proficient speaker reading a text, and they read along with the transcript at the same time, trying to mimic the speaker's pauses, rhythm, intonation, and stress patterns as closely as possible.
So actively copying the musicality of the language.
That's a great way to put it. Educate suggests using resources like dailysl.com or teachers making recordings of themselves or colleagues. It helps learners internalize the natural flow of spoken English.
That sounds really effective. It moves beyond just knowing the rules to actually feeling the rhythm. Okay, excellent practical advice on pronunciation. Let's move to our final source, the study from Algeria on motivation.
Yes, the University Ahmed Draya Adrar study. This brings us back to that crucial internal factor, what drives learners, especially comparing online versus in-person experiences.
Motivation seems like the engine for everything else we've discussed, doesn't it? You can have the best methods, but without motivation.
Progress is going to be slow and difficult, absolutely. This study looks specifically at first-year university English students in Adrar.
What theoretical ideas about motivation did they explore first?
They covered several key theories. Gardner's socioeducational model was one. This emphasizes the desire to learn the language and the satisfaction derived from it.
And things like wanting to integrate with the target culture.
Yes, integrativeness is a key part of Gardner's model, along with positive attitudes towards the learning situation itself, the teacher, the course, etc. Motivated learners, in this view, are eager, put in effort, and actually enjoy the process.
Okay. What other theories?
Sociocognitive models, which focus more on how learners' perceptions of the classroom environment and their interactions within it shape motivation.
So feeling comfortable, supported, engaged in the class itself.
Exactly. Then there's self-determination theory, which is very influential. It distinguishes between intrinsic motivation, doing something for the inherent enjoyment, and satisfaction.
Like learning English because you just love the language or love learning.
Right. Versus extrinsic motivation, doing something for an external reward or to avoid punishment.
Like needing English for a job or passing an exam.
Precisely. Self-determination theory also stresses the importance of autonomy, feeling like you have some choice and control over your learning.
Feeling empowered, not just forced.
Yes. They also touch on goal-setting theory, the idea that having clear, specific, challenging, but achievable goals drives performance, especially if you're committed to them.
Having something concrete to aim for.
And finally, goal orientation theory, which looks at why you're pursuing those goals. Is it about truly mastering the material, mastery orientation, or just about demonstrating competence or outperforming others, performance orientation?
Okay, so lots of different lenses to view motivation through. How does this apply specifically to learning English?
The study reiterates the strong link found in decades of research. Both aptitude, natural ability, and motivation are powerful predictors of success in learning a second language. You need both, but motivation can often compensate for lower aptitude to some extent.
You can overcome challenges if you're driven enough.
That's the idea. They also mention the global status of English as a major motivator, people learning it for instrumental reasons. Jobs, travel, access to information, technology.
A practical necessity for many.
Indeed. They quote Pitcorder's famous line, "Given motivation, it is inevitable that a human being will learn a second language if he is exposed to the language data."
A strong statement about the power of motivation.
It really is. If the drive is there and the opportunity, exposure is there, learning will happen.
Okay, so let's get to the specifics of their study in Adrar. What did they find out from the student questionnaires?
Well, first, most students self-rated as beginners, around 63%, and a large majority, nearly 65%, said their main reason for learning English was because it's the language of the world.
So primarily, instrumental motivation seems dominant in that group.
It appears so. But here's a really striking finding. Almost 60% of these students reported that the online classes they'd experienced had not been at all effective for them.
Not at all. That's pretty damning feedback for online learning in that context.
It is. And they identified specific reasons why.
What were the main complaints?
A major one was the lack of face-to-face engagement. They missed the direct interaction with the instructor and their peers.
That social connection and immediate feedback loop.
Exactly. They also cited very practical problems. unreliable internet connections, and not always having suitable devices or quiet places to study at home.
Ah, the digital divide and infrastructure issues. That's a huge factor, often overlooked in discussions about online learning benefits.
Absolutely, critical context. These practical barriers significantly impacted their ability to engage effectively online.
So, did they express clear preference for in-person learning?
Overwhelmingly, yes. Over half, 54.5%, said they'd prefer all their classes to be in person. And a massive 89% agreed that face-to-face contact with instructors was necessary.
Wow. They really value that direct human connection in the learning process.
It seems fundamental to their perception of effective learning. They also felt more in control of their learning in face-to-face settings, 89% agreement again, and felt they could focus better with a teacher and classmates, physical present, 64% agreement.
That sense of structure, support, and shared experience in a physical classroom.
It seems very important for this particular group of learners.
Did the study look at whether they used online resources for self-study outside of formal classes?
Yes, and interestingly, about 59% said they had not taken any extra online courses or used specific online tools to improve their English beyond their required coursework.
So despite the global importance motivation, they weren't actively seeking out extra online learning, maybe focusing just on passing the university courses.
That's what the researchers seem to suggest. Perhaps a focus on graduation requirements rather than broader, self-initiated skill improvement using online means. However, there's a slight twist.
Oh.
When asked how they would prefer to improve their English if they were doing it on their own, independently, 68% said they preferred to learn by themselves in a flexible manner.
Hold on. So they disliked the formal online classes from the university, but they liked the idea of flexible, self-directed online learning. That seems contradictory.
It does seem a bit contradictory at first glance. Perhaps it's about the structure and perceived lack of engagement in the mandatory online classes versus the autonomy and choice involved in picking your own resources for self-study.
Maybe. Or maybe the mandatory classes just weren't well designed or supported, given the technical issues they faced.
That's also very possible. The study concludes that the learning environment itself online versus in-person, and the quality of that environment clearly has a significant impact on these students' motivation and perception of progress. For this group, the perceived drawbacks of online learning, both pedagogical and practical, outweigh the benefits.
It really underscores that online learning isn't one single thing. The design, the support, the context, the learner preferences, they all matter hugely.
Absolutely. It's not inherently good or bad. Its effectiveness is highly dependent on these factors.
Okay, we've covered a huge amount of ground here, drawing from all these different sources. So let's try to synthesize this for our listener, the learner. What are the big takeaways?
Well, as we've seen, learning English is definitely a complex journey, isn't it? There are common hurdles, those pesky prepositions, maybe pronunciation challenges, the filler words.
Right, the obstacles are real.
But there are also loads of effective strategies and tools available. Things like understanding how your L1 can actually help you, not just hinder you. Using smart techniques like spaced repetition for vocabulary, exploring different technologies.
Finding what works for you from that toolkit.
Exactly. And then there's this huge overlay of motivation and learning environment, which seems absolutely pivotal.
Yeah, that Algerian study really brought that home. For those students, the in-person environment, that direct connection, feeling in control, that was key to their motivation.
It was for them, yes. But that doesn't mean online or self-study isn't valuable. Naatik highlighted the flexibility. Khazar showed the power of specific online tools like SRS. It's about finding your right blend.
So the ultimate message is personalization.
Yeah.
Self-awareness.
I think so. It's about being aware of the common pitfalls, experimenting with different methods, maybe try mirroring for pronunciation, maybe set up an SRS for vocab, maybe find a language exchange partner.
Actively trying things out.
Yes. And critically, paying attention to what actually keeps you engaged. What makes you want to keep going? Is it the satisfaction of understanding a movie? The need for a job? The connection with a language partner? Whatever your driver is, harness it.
And choose or create a learning environment that supports that motivation, whether it's a structured class, online flexibility, or self-study with specific resources.
Precisely. Consistent effort, driven by your motivation in an environment that works for you. That seems to be the recipe.
So what should our listener, the learner, be thinking about right now after hearing all this?
Well, maybe take a moment to reflect. Which of those common mistakes resonate? Are prepositions a sticking point? Do you rely on fillers? could you consciously work on those?
Okay, identify personal challenges.
And then think about the strategies. Could SRS help with vocabulary? Is mirroring for pronunciation something you could try? Could you find more opportunities for real communication, maybe through a language exchange?
So actively choose 1 or 2 new things to implement.
Maybe just one to start. Make it manageable. And then that bigger question, what really motivates you? Intrinsic joy, extrinsic goals. And does your current learning setup, how and where you study, actually align with that motivation and your preferred style?
If you thrive on social interaction, maybe relying solely on a solo app isn't the best fit long term.
Possibly not. Or if you need flexibility, maybe trying to stick to a rigid class schedule is just setting yourself up for frustration. It's about that alignment.
So the challenge for the learner is, how can you consciously tweak your routine based on these insights? Add one strategy, perhaps. And how can you adjust your learning environment or approach to better match what keeps you motivated and engaged?
Those seem like the key questions to ponder. It's about taking conscious control of your learning journey, informed by these different perspectives.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for walking us through all of that. It's been a really comprehensive exploration.
My pleasure. It's fascinating to see how all these different pieces, practical advice, cognitive science, pedagogical research, motivation studies, all fit together.
It really is. And hopefully it's given everyone listening some valuable food for thought and practical ideas to try out. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
Thanks for having me.
And a huge thank you to all of you who stayed with us through this detailed discussion. We really appreciate you sticking around till the end.
We do indeed.
So today, we're really embarking on a fascinating exploration into the science and, well, the art of learning and memory.
Mm-hmm.
You've shared with us a really diverse set of resources. It's quite a collection, actually.
It really is. A good mix.
And our mission today is basically to extract the most effective science-backed strategies from all this stuff to help you, the listener, learn pretty much anything faster and, more effectively.
We're hoping to cut through some of the noise, right?
Yeah.
Get to the core ideas.
Exactly. We're not just skimming the surface. We're diving deep. We've got, let's see, a scientific article on feedback and importancia do feedback. Something.
Como ferramenta do ensino e aprendizaje.
Yeah. The importance of feedback as a teaching and learning tool. Right. And the fascinating world of neuroscience e aprendizaje, neuroscience and learning.
That's always interesting stuff.
Plus, hands-on advice from a YouTube video on mind mapping. Something about doing it simply and quickly.
Como fazer mapa mental de forma simples y rápida, yeah. Looks very practical.
And Ali Abdal's evidence-based learning hacks from his video, How to Learn Anything Faster.
Abdal always has some solid, actionable tips.
Then there's Jose Moran's perspectives on active learning. Metodologias ativas para uma aprendizagem mais profunda.
Deeper learning, right?
Right, moving beyond just passive listening.
The intricacies of mnemonics from Wikipedia, always a classic source.
Can't beat Wikipedia for a quick overview sometimes.
And finally, some powerful memorization techniques from a site called RH Portal. Técnicas de memorización y aprendizaje acelerada. Accelerated learning.
So a really wide range, from theory to very specific techniques.
Exactly. So get ready to move beyond that feeling of information overload and hopefully unlock those crucial aha moments that, make learning so rewarding. What's really striking, I think, about the material you've pulled together is that range.
Yeah.
We're looking at everything from the educational theory behind it all to very practical step-by-step techniques and even digging into the actual neuroscience, how our brains process and hang on to information.
Yeah, the brain stuff is always mind-blowing.
So our goal is really to weave all of this together into a framework that's not just interesting to listen to, but genuinely useful for you in your own learning journey.
Okay, sounds like a plan. So let's get started with a concept that might seem a little, backwards at first. Preparing how you learn before you even think about what you're going to learn.
Yes. The meta-learning aspect.
Right. Ali Abdal brings up this fantastic analogy, often attributed to Abraham Lincoln, the one. Give me 6 hours to chop down a tree, and I will spend the first 4 sharpening the axe.
Classic. And so relevant to learning.
For you, the listener, this basically means taking some time to think about your learning process itself. Don't just jump in.
That's a really insightful starting point, isn't it? This idea of sharpening the axe is all about that learning about how to learn effectively.
Yeah.
Before you dive into a new skill or subject, it's actually really beneficial to understand the best approaches. It's like checking the map before you start the hike.
Exactly. Abdal gives a great example. Say you're aiming to learn guitar by ear. He suggests it might be really helpful to spend some time on like a subreddit for piano learning.
Huh. Okay, why piano?
Well, because you might pick up some foundational techniques or insights into music theory or just how music works that will actually speed up your guitar learning later on, even though it's not directly guitar practice.
Ah, I see. So you're learning the underlying principles.
Yes. It's about researching how the meta skills before you even, strum your first chord. He even recommends the book Make It Stick for really solid, study-focused learning strategies.
Right. Make It Stick is excellent.
Yeah.
Very evidence-based.
It's like making sure you have the right tools in your cognitive toolkit before you start tackling the actual learning task itself.
And this preparation isn't just about understanding broad learning strategies. It also means creating the right conditions for learning, especially focus.
Oh, definitely. It's so hard to learn anything if your attention is all over the place.
Exactly. It's difficult for anyone, really, to absorb and retain new information when their attention is constantly being pulled left and right.
Absolutely. So one really simple but honestly powerful tool that Abdal mentions for optimizing focus is the 5-minute rule.
Ah, yes, the 5-minute rule. Good one.
If you're finding it hard to start a learning task, maybe you're procrastinating on studying or, writing something, just commit to working on it for 5 minutes. Just 5.
Mm-hmm.
Often, the biggest hurdle is just getting started, right? And those first 5 minutes can build surprising momentum and sort of trick you into getting into a state of flow.
That really speaks to overcoming that initial inertia, doesn't it? It's about lowering the activation energy need to just begin.
Yeah, activation energy, I like that.
Once you're actually engaged, the task itself often feels much less daunting than it seemed beforehand. It's like that first push to get a heavy flywheel spinning.
Totally. And then there's something that sounds incredibly obvious, but is so crucial in our modern world: eliminating distractions. Like actually putting your phone away or turning off notifications.
Seems basic, but it's probably one of the hardest things for people to do consistently.
It really is. In our hyper-connected lives where notifications and social media are constantly screaming for our attention, actively removing these interruptions can be a total game changer for your ability to focus deeply and learn effectively.
But creating that mental space.
Exactly. You're allowing your brain to actually engage with the material without being constantly pinged.
So these initial steps, consciously preparing how you'll approach learning and actively optimizing your ability to focus, they lay a really strong foundation, don't they?
For sure.
For more effective and efficient engagement with the learning material itself. It's like preparing fertile ground before you plant the seeds of knowledge.
Nice analogy. Okay, so you've taken the time to prepare. You've maybe used the 5-minute rule. Your phone's on silent. Now, how do you actually dive into the learning process itself?
Right, the doing part.
Abdallah, drawing on Scott Young's really intense language learning experiences, you mentioned his book, Ultra Learning, emphasizes the powerful principle of immersion.
Ah, yes. Learning in context.
Basically, the idea is that you learn best when you're in an environment that closely mirrors where you'll actually use the skill or knowledge.
Immersion creates a really strong and direct link, doesn't it? Between the context where you're learning and the context where you'll need to apply it.
Yeah.
This makes the learning feel more relevant, more practical, and ultimately it's much easier to recall and use when you actually need it. It's about embedding the learning in a real-world scenario as much as possible.
Totally. Abdal's own experience learning magic is a fantastic illustration of this.
Oh, yeah. Tell me about that.
Well, initially, he practiced his tricks, in front of a mirror or maybe his webcam,
Right.
which was helpful for getting the basic moves down, sure.
Okay, standard practice.
But his skills really, leveled up when he started performing for real people at gigs, parties, whatever. He was fully immersed in the actual performance environment.
Dealing with real audiences, the pressure.
Exactly. The pressure of live performance, people watching, that pushed him way outside his comfort zone and led to, significant and really rapid improvement in his actual magic abilities.
That really highlights the importance of what we might call authentic practice. The closer the conditions of your practice are to the real-world application,
the better the learning sticks.
Precisely. The more effective your learning will be. It's not just about theoretical knowledge. It's about practical competence, right? In the environment where it actually matters.
Okay, so building on this idea of actively engaging, Abdal also stresses the real importance of figuring out your weak links, identifying where you're struggling.
The uncomfortable bits.
He shares his own experience from medical school, realizing he should be focusing most on the areas he found most challenging, the stuff he dreaded seeing on an exam.
Right.
So for you, the listener, this means identifying the aspects of a subject or a skill that you consistently stumble over or feel unsure about.
And this requires a good degree of, let's be honest, self-awareness and intellectual honesty, doesn't it?
Totally.
It can be really tempting to just spend more time on the topics you already understand and feel comfortable with because, it feels good. It's reinforcing.
Yeah, you feel smart reviewing stuff you already know.
Exactly. But genuine learning and actual growth often happen when you actively confront your weaknesses and really work to improve in those specific areas.
So his strategy was actually quite simple, but really effective. He would regularly ask himself, if the exam were tomorrow, what topic would I be least happy about being tested on?
Ooh, that's a good question to ask yourself. Brutal, but effective.
Right. It immediately highlights the areas needing the most attention. It's about deliberately focusing on that discomfort zone in your learning, because that's often where the most significant progress is made, pushing the boundaries.
Precisely. Avoiding those difficult areas might give you a temporary sense of accomplishment, sure, by focusing on what you already know.
Right. False confidence, maybe.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah.
But ultimately, it creates gaps in your understanding that will hinder your long-term progress and your ability to truly master the subject. You got to face the tricky stuff.
And this leads us very nicely to one of the absolute core principles of effective learning, active recall, sometimes called retrieval practice.
Oh, yes, this is a big one. Crucial.
Abdel really emphasizes this. Learning isn't just about passively putting information into your brain like reading or watching a lecture. It's fundamentally about actively trying to pull that information out.
Active recall is such a powerful mechanism for strengthening those memory traces in the brain.
How does that work neurologically?
Well, every time you successfully retrieve a piece of information from your memory, you're essentially reinforcing the neural connections associated with that knowledge. You're making that pathway stronger, more efficient.
So it becomes easier to access next time.
Exactly. More readily accessible in the future. It's like strengthening a path by walking on it repeatedly.
Think about it for a moment.
Yeah.
You can read a chapter in a textbook or listen to a lecture and feel like, yeah, I got this.
Mm-hmm. The illusion of competence.
Right. But if you don't actively try to recall the key concepts and ideas a few days later, you might be shocked at how much you've actually forgotten.
Oh, definitely. It evaporates surprisingly quickly.
That's where self-testing comes in. Testing in this context isn't just about getting a grade for school. It's an absolutely crucial learning strategy in and of itself.
It is the learning in many ways.
Yeah. And it's important to embrace this concept of desirable difficulty when you're doing active recall.
Desirable difficulty. Explain that a bit.
It means the level of challenge should be slightly above your current comfort zone. You should have to struggle a bit.
Okay.
If it's too easy, if you recall it instantly with no effort, you're not really strengthening those memory pathways very much.
Right. No real workout for the brain.
But if it's too hard, if you just can't retrieve it at all, you can become discouraged and give up.
Finding that sweet spot.
Exactly. The sweet spot is that slightly uncomfortable zone where you have to really work to retrieve and apply the information. That effort is what makes the memory stronger.
That makes perfect sense. It's like physical fitness again.
Mm-hmm.
Lifting weights that are too light doesn't build much muscle.
Right?
But weights that are way too heavy, you risk injury or just can't lift them. Learning is similar. That slight struggle during active recall is actually what leads to stronger, more durable learning.
Okay, so that struggle is good. Now, speaking of improvement and getting better, another really key factor in speeding up your learning is feedback.
Yes, absolutely critical. Regular, intense feedback, as Ali Abdaal calls it. And this is strongly supported by that scientific article you mentioned earlier, the one by Paiva et al.
Right. Importância do feedback.
Como ferramenta do ensino e aprendizagem. Yes. The importance of feedback as a tool.
So, Abdal points out that when you're first starting something new, positive feedback can be incredibly encouraging, right? It helps build your initial enthusiasm, keeps you going.
Sure, that initial boost is important.
However, for serious, sustained improvement, you really need to focus on seeking out and actually using constructive criticism.
This is where it gets a bit harder, maybe emotionally, but it's crucial.
He uses that great analogy of a personal trainer giving you feedback on your exercise form.
Right, I like that.
They're not just saying good job all the time. They're pointing out exactly what you need to adjust, like lift your elbow higher or keep your back straight to perform the exercise more effectively and, importantly, avoid injury.
It's about identifying specifically What needs to change to get better? Actionable advice.
Exactly. And the Paiva et al. Article really underscores this vital role of feedback within an educational context, right?
It does. It emphasizes that feedback isn't just a one-way street, teacher to student. It's a crucial and dynamic tool for both the educator and the learner.
How so?
Well, it helps both sides identify any deficiencies, any misunderstandings, any gaps in either the teaching process or the learning process.
So everyone can adjust?
Precisely.
Yeah.
And take corrective actions for successful teaching and learning.
The article actually highlights that effective feedback can lead to improvements in the teacher-student relationship, too.
That makes sense. Builds trust.
And can significantly boost student engagement in the learning process. It helps minimize uncertainties a student might have.
Yeah, it clears things up.
And allows for that necessary readaptation of behaviors throughout the learning journey. That's a really powerful set of benefits, isn't it?
Absolutely. The authors stress that for feedback to be truly effective, it needs to be carefully planned, well-structured.
Not just random comments?
Yeah. No, not random. And crucially, it needs to be perceived by the students as something helpful, something that leads them toward greater autonomy in their own learning.
Right, empowering them.
It's about guiding them to become self-regulated learners who can identify their own strengths and weaknesses and know what to do about them.
And it's not just about pointing out errors, is it? I think the article mentions something about self-esteem.
Yes, exactly. It highlights that good feedback can contribute positively to a student's self-esteem by focusing on the path toward improvement and future success,
Okay.
rather than solely dwelling on past mistakes. It helps develop both cognitive strategies, how we think, and metacognitive strategies, how we think about our thinking.
Thinking about thinking. Meta.
What's also really important, according to the research cited in that article, is the active role the student should play in the feedback discussion.
So it's a two-way conversation.
Ideally, yes. They should have the chance to confirm their understanding of the feedback, maybe add their own perspective, or even respectfully challenge or adjust their understanding based on what they heard.
Okay, so it's a dialogue.
A true dialogue, not just a monologue of evaluation saying, you did this wrong.
Right. So feedback really acts as both an assessment, where are you now, and a prognosis, what's the path forward.
Well put. It helps everyone involved, learner and instructor, to better understand the curriculum, the goals, and the specific skills that need to be developed.
Ultimately, as the article concludes, this kind of effective feedback is absolutely vital for regulating both teaching and learning.
And fostering that greater student autonomy in the end.
So clearly, feedback, when it's done well and actively used, is a really powerful catalyst for both improving skills and getting a deeper understanding.
No doubt about it.
Okay, so you've actively engaged, you've practiced recalling, you've gotten valuable feedback. What's the next step in really making that knowledge stick for the long haul?
How do we lock it in?
Ali Abdaal introduces this interesting concept of overlearning. Now, this doesn't mean just mindlessly repeating something over and over again, does it?
No, that's a key distinction. That's just rote memorization, which isn't always that effective long term. Overlearning, in this context, means going beyond the point of immediate competence or just knowing the basics.
Okay, so what does it involve?
It involves continuously asking yourself why. Why things work the way they do, even after you feel like you understand the surface level. It's about building a much deeper, more fundamental level of understanding.
He gives that really insightful example comparing doctors, right?
This is the doctor's example.
Yeah.
Some doctors might just memorize the standard medical guidelines for treating a specific condition. They know what to do.
Right, follow the protocol.
But a doctor who has truly overlearned will understand the underlying principles, the physiology, the pharmacology, the why behind the guidelines.
Ah, okay. So they know why the protocol exists.
Exactly. And that doctor with a deeper understanding is likely to be much more adaptable and effective when faced with complex or unusual cases where the standard guidelines might not perfectly fit. They can reason from first principles.
That makes a lot of sense. It's the crucial difference between simply knowing that something works and truly understanding why it works.
Precisely. If we apply this back to learning guitar,
Okay.
it's not just about memorizing the finger placements for a chord or a song. It's also taking the time to understand the underlying music theory. How are chords constructed? How do melodies relate to chords? Why does this progression sound good?
So learning the grammar of music, not just the phrases.
Exactly. This deeper theoretical knowledge will make learning related musical concepts and new songs much easier in the long run. You have a framework.
Okay, overlearning for depth. Now, what about just plain forgetting? We all do it.
The enemy of learning. forgetting.
Abdal brings up the famous forgetting curve, developed by Hermann Ebbinghaus way back when.
Yes, Ebbinghaus and his curve, a cornerstone of memory research.
And the crucial counter strategy he highlights is spacing, often referred to as spaced repetition. For you, the listener, this means revisiting information at increasing intervals over time.
The forgetting curve dramatically shows how quickly our memory of new information just decays if we don't actively work to retain it. It drops off fast initially.
Scary fast sometimes.
Spaced repetition is a technique designed specifically to combat that curve. It involves revisiting and testing yourself on learned material at progressively longer intervals.
So not cramming it all in at once.
Definitely not cramming.
Yeah.
This active recall, spaced out over time, helps to strengthen those memory traces we talked about and move information from your fragile short-term memory into more robust long-term memory.
So back to the guitar example. If you're learning a new song,
Right.
you wouldn't just practice it intensively for like 3 hours on Monday and then not touch it again until next Monday.
That's inefficient.
Instead, using spacing, you'd practice it on day one, then maybe review it briefly the next day, then perhaps a few days later, then maybe a week after that, then a month, and so on.
Those spaced practice sessions reinforce the learning over time and help encode the information much more durably into your long-term memory.
And thankfully, we have tools for this now, right? It's not just relying on your calendar.
Absolutely. We have great digital tools available to help implement spaced repetition systematically. Apps like Anki are probably the most well-known.
How do they work?
They basically automate the scheduling of your review sessions. You rate how well you remember each flashcard or piece of information, and the algorithm calculates the optimal time for you to see it again sooner if you struggled, much later if you recalled it easily.
That sounds super useful, especially for like facts or vocabulary.
Very useful, particularly for fact-based learning, yeah. Languages, medical terms, historical dates, that kind of thing.
And this whole idea of spacing your learning and revisiting material over time ties directly into the neuroscience of memory, doesn't it? That Neuroscientia e Aprendizagem article touched on this.
It absolutely does. The article explains that the process of learning itself involves actual physical modifications in our central nervous system. Our brains are literally changing.
Wow.
And this process is largely driven by neuroplasticity, which in simple terms is the brain's remarkable lifelong ability to form new connections between neurons.
Synapses.
Right, synapses. And also to weaken or prune away connections that aren't being used anymore. Your brain is constantly rewiring itself based on your experiences and what you focus on.
So when you learn something new, your brain is literally building new connections, new pathways.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
It creates new synapses and strengthens the existing neural circuits involved in processing that information. Conversely, if you don't use certain knowledge or skills, those connections can weaken over time. It really is a use it or lose it scenario at the neural level.
Fascinating. And it takes time, right? It's not instant.
No, definitely not instant. Consolidating this new information into permanent long-term memory requires both metabolic energy and time. Your brain needs resources to build those connections.
What helps with that consolidation?
The article emphasizes that repetition, especially spaced repetition, is key. Also, actively elaborating on new knowledge by linking it to things you already know, creating those connections.
Making it meaningful.
Exactly. And, crucially, the process of memory consolidation that primarily happens while you sleep. Sleep is absolutely vital for locking in learning.
So pulling an all-nighter to cram is counterproductive.
Very counterproductive for long-term retention, yes. You might retain it for the test the next morning, but much of it will likely vanish soon after because it wasn't properly consolidated.
Good to know. The article also reiterates that actively connecting new information to real-life situations
Making it relevant.
and making a conscious effort to periodically retrieve that information from memory are both essential for long-term retention. It's not enough to just passively absorb. You have to actively engage and make it relevant to you.
So putting it all together, overlearning to build that deeper understanding, and strategically spacing your review sessions using active recall, those are incredibly powerful techniques.
Yeah. For moving information from short-term working memory into long-term storage and building a really robust, lasting understanding.
Couldn't agree more.
Okay, now let's shift gears slightly. Let's talk about a learning strategy that might seem a bit counterintuitive at first. Ali Abdal introduces the idea: teach what you're learning.
Ah, the protege effect.
Yeah.
Or learning by teaching. Yes, very powerful.
How does teaching others actually help you learn better? It seems like you should be focusing on your own learning.
It's surprisingly effective for a few key reasons. As the author C.S. Lewis insightfully put it, there's often a curse of knowledge.
The curse of knowledge, what's that?
Once you become an expert in something, you can actually forget what it was like not to know it. All the background context becomes obvious to you.
Right, you assume everyone knows what you know.
Exactly. Which can make it surprisingly difficult to explain things clearly to a beginner. Because of this, you often learn best from people who are just a step or two ahead of you on a learning curve. They still remember the struggles.
Abdul gives that relatable example of medical students, doesn't he?
He does. They often find they learn most effectively from students in the year just above them.
Why?
Because those slightly more senior students have recently gone through the exact same material, they understand the current level of knowledge of the junior students, and they remember the specific challenges and tricky points they faced just a year ago.
So they can explain it better at the right level.
Often, yes. And the act of teaching itself forces you, the teacher, to organize your thoughts, structure the information logically, and articulate it in a clear and coherent way so that someone else can understand it.
You have to really break it down.
You do. This process of structuring and explaining really solidifies your own understanding, and it can quickly reveal any gaps or fuzzy areas in your knowledge that you might not have even been aware of before you tried to explain it.
If you can explain something simply, it usually means you understand it deeply, right?
That's generally a very good sign, yes.
Okay, so this concept of actively engaging, processing information, and structuring it to explain to someone else, it leads us very nicely to José Moran's discussion on metodologias ativas para uma aprendizagem mais profunda.
Active methodologies for deeper learning. Yes, a perfect connection.
He really champions the idea of learners being active participants in their own education, not just passive recipients.
Moran emphasizes that if we want to cultivate students or learners of any age, really who are proactive, creative, critical thinkers, we need to move away from those traditional passive methods.
It's like just listening to lectures.
Exactly. And instead, embrace methodologies that actively involve learners in increasingly complex activities. Activities that require decision-making, problem-solving, evaluation, actual engagement.
It's about shifting the focus from the teacher just delivering information
to the student actively constructing their own understanding, taking ownership.
Moran also highlights the really important role that technology and digital literacy play in modern education, doesn't he?
He does. And he discusses how the role of the teacher is evolving alongside that. Less of the sage on the stage, more of the guide on the side.
So the teacher becomes more of a facilitator.
A guide, a facilitator, a curator of resources, even a designer of individualized learning paths. It's about recognizing that everyone learns in slightly different ways and trying to cater to those differences by offering more personalized approaches.
That sounds challenging, but also really valuable.
It is. And in this shift, the use of well-elaborated learning materials, whether they're texts, videos, interactive simulations, whatever, becomes absolutely crucial.
For what purpose?
For motivation, for illustrating complex concepts, for providing guidance, for offering opportunities for formative assessment, checking understanding along the way, not just at the end.
Okay.
And teachers can really leverage technology here to encourage students to become producers of content themselves, not just passive consumers. Making videos, writing blogs, creating presentations.
Right, actively doing something with the information. Moran specifically discusses the aula invertida, which we usually call the flipped classroom model.
Yes, the flipped classroom, a classic active methodology.
Explain that again briefly.
In this approach, students engage with the basic informational content, maybe watching lecture videos, doing readings outside of class time on their own.
Okay, homework first, essentially.
Sort of. Then, the valuable synchronous class time is freed up for much deeper engagement, problem-solving sessions, group discussions, debates, collaborative projects, getting help from the teacher and peers. It inverts the traditional lecture then homework model.
Makes sense. He also mentions aprendizaje baseada en problemas, or PBL, problem-based learning.
Right, PBL. Another powerful active methodology. It's rooted in active school principles and the scientific method.
How does PBL typically work?
Usually, students work collaboratively in small groups to tackle complex, often ill-defined, real-world problems. The problem comes first, and the learning happens as they research and figure out what they need to know to solve it.
So the problem drives the learning.
Exactly. It often requires integrating knowledge from multiple subject areas, too. Very engaging.
And he also touches on aprendizaje baseada en projetos, project-based learning, right? Similar, but different.
Similar philosophy, yes. Project-based learning often has a longer time frame than a single PBL problem, and usually emphasizes the creation of a tangible final product, presentation, or performance as an outcome.
Okay, so there's a concrete thing at the end.
Often, yes.
Yeah.
These projects are frequently interdisciplinary and can be strongly connected to addressing real-world needs or engaging in service learning within the community. Moran even mentions projetos transdisciplinares that go beyond individual subjects entirely to tackle really broad, complex issues.
Wow. So lots of ways to make learning more active.
Definitely. And what's really interesting is how well these active learning methodologies that Moran describes align with the neuroscience principles we were discussing earlier from the Neurosciência e Aprendizagem article.
How so? What's the connection?
Well, that article reinforces the core idea that active engagement is absolutely crucial for meaningful and lasting learning. Our brains learn best by doing, not just by passively receiving.
Makes sense. Does it mention specific active methods?
It specifically mentions the effectiveness of peer instruction, a method championed by Eric Khazar at Harvard, where students interact with each other, discuss concepts, try to convince each other, and arrive at solutions together.
Learning from peers again.
Exactly. It also highlights the positive role that making mistakes and then correcting them plays in the learning process. Apparently, making an error and realizing it actually activates specific neural circuits that, in effect, show us where our incorrect thinking pathways were.
So mistakes are actually good for the brain.
In a learning context, yes. They help refine understanding. This really underscores that fundamental shift from traditional teacher-centered methods to more student-centered approaches that prioritize active participation and deeper critical reflection.
It's about empowering you, the learner, to take ownership and actively construct your own understanding.
Precisely.
Okay, so we've covered preparing, focusing, immersing, finding weaknesses, active recall, feedback, overlearning, spacing, teaching others, and active methodologies. What else is in our toolkit? Let's talk specific memory techniques.
Right, the hacks and tricks. This brings us to those other resources. Técnicas de memorização e aprendizagem acelerada from RH Portal and the Wikipedia entry on mnemonics.
Okay.
These resources delve into a variety of practical ways you can consciously improve your learning speed, your ability to retain information, and your overall mental agility. Little tricks of the trade, if you will.
So what are some key ideas from the RH Portal article?
It highlights the importance of repetition, which we've touched on, but also, perhaps surprisingly, emotional connection. Things that evoke an emotion are often remembered more easily.
That makes sense, like remembering where you were during a major event.
Exactly. It also emphasizes the power of creating intentional associations between new information and things you already know, making deliberate links. This is a key pillar of effective memory.
And that idea of association leads us straight into mnemonics, right?
Perfectly. Wikipedia defines mnemonics as specific memory aids that use various types of associations, visual, auditory, wordplay, acronyms, rhymes, to help you remember information, especially lists or sequences.
It's all about creating memorable links or hooks for your brain.
Exactly. Mental shortcuts. Wikipedia provides a really rich collection of examples across tons of subjects.
Like what? Give us some classics.
Well, for a simple one, think about remembering the number of days in each month using your knuckles.
Oh yeah, 30 days half September. Or the knuckle trick.
Right. For physics, there are mnemonic rules to help remember suffixes for different types of acids and salts. In chemistry, mnemonics are super popular.
For what specifically?
Remembering the order of elements in periodic table columns, or the trend of electronegativity across the table, or the naming system, the nomenclature for simple organic molecules like alkanes.
You mentioned one earlier in Portuguese.
Yes, mel e parabolas. A common Portuguese mnemonic for the first four alkanes: methane, ethane, propane, butane, based on the first letters M, E, P, B.
Clever. What about biology or geology?
Biology has the classic Linnaean taxonomy mnemonic. King Philip came over for good soup, or variations thereof for kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species.
I remember that one.
Geology uses mnemonics for remembering the order of geological periods, Cambrian, Ordovician, Silurian, etc., often using silly sentences. And of course, the planets.
My very educated mother just served us noodles.
Exactly. For Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune. These mnemonics work by creating that memorable hook, making it much easier to recall otherwise dry lists or abstract concepts.
So mnemonics are great for lists and sequences. What about understanding connections between ideas?
For that, another really powerful technique is mind mapping. It was created or at least popularized by Tony Buzan, and it's well explained in that Estudio Fora YouTube video you shared.
How does mind mapping help with memory and reasoning?
It uses a visual radial tree structure. You start with a central idea, and then branches radiate outwards for main topics, with smaller branches for details. This visual, nonlinear layout is thought to stimulate mental fixation and organization in a way that mirrors how our brains naturally link ideas through association.
More like how the brain works than linear notes, maybe.
That's the argument. The YouTube video breaks it down into 5 simple steps.
What are they?
1. Start with your central idea or topic clearly in the middle.
Yeah.
2. Create main branches radiating out, labeled with concise keywords. 3. Add secondary branches extending from those with more specific related ideas. 4. Use colors, images, symbols throughout to make it visually engaging and memorable. Use lots of visuals.
Okay, and 5?
5, and this is crucial, regularly review your mind map. Look it over, redraw connections, mentally walk through it to reinforce the links and aid recall.
Seems like a great way to organize complex information visually. The RH Portal article also mentioned some other accelerated learning techniques.
It did. A few other useful ones. One is simply simplifying complex notes by rewriting them in your own plain language. That act of processing really solidifies understanding.
Like the teaching principle again, almost. Explaining it to yourself.
Very similar, yes. They also mention intentionally alternating between focused and diffuse thinking modes. This is a concept popularized by Barbara Oakley in her work, Learning How to Learn.
Focused and diffuse modes.
Focus mode is when you're actively concentrating, trying to solve a problem directly. Diffuse mode is more relaxed, like when you're taking a walk or showering, your mind wanders, and it can allow your brain to make unexpected connections or find creative solutions when your focused mind feels stuck.
So taking breaks is actually productive.
Intentionally switching modes can be very productive, yes. The article also highlights using coded notes, using different colors or symbols to organize and prioritize information visually.
Makes it easier to scan and find things.
Right. And finally, they circle back to spaced learning, which we talked about with spaced repetition, intentionally dividing content into smaller chunks and reviewing them at increasing intervals. They credit Paul Kelly with popularizing a specific spaced learning classroom method.
Okay. So it's clear there's a whole toolbox of memory techniques and accelerated learning strategies out there.
Absolutely. From mnemonics for lists, mind maps for connections, spacing for retention, understanding focus versus diffuse thinking.
The key seems to be experimenting, right? Finding what works for you.
Exactly. Experiment with these different approaches and find what resonates best with your individual learning style, the type of material you're learning, and your specific goals. There's no single magic bullet.
Right. Now, to really round out our understanding of how we learn best, it feels important to briefly touch upon the underlying neuroscience of attention, motivation, and emotions. That neuroscience article covered these too, didn't it?
It did. These neurological processes play such a fundamental role in our ability to learn and remember effectively. They're like the bedrock upon which all these strategies operate.
So what did it say about attention? We mentioned focus earlier.
It emphasizes that attention is really the crucial gateway to learning. You simply can't effectively engage with new information if your attention is scattered. So minimizing distractions is key, as we discussed.
Anything else on attention?
It points out something interesting. Our sensory system tends to respond more strongly to contrast and novelty, things that stand out. This suggests that incorporating varied stimuli in your learning materials or environment can help capture and maintain attention. Don't let it get too monotonous.
Okay, mix it up a bit, and connecting learning to real-world benefits helps too, right?
Vital, yes. Connecting it to what's in it for me or how it applies to your life is crucial for both capturing attention initially and maintaining it over time, making it relevant.
What about motivation? How does the brain handle that?
Well, the article mentions the broad categories. Intrinsic motivation, which comes from within genuine interest, enjoyment, curiosity.
Learning for the sake of learning.
Right. And extrinsic motivation, which is driven by external factors, rewards like grades or money, or pressures like deadlines, or avoiding punishment.
And which is better for learning?
Research, including work cited like Daniel Pink's, suggests that intrinsic motivation often linked to feelings of autonomy, having control, mastery, getting better at something, and purpose, connecting to a larger goal, tends to be a much more powerful and sustainable driver for deep learning.
So finding that internal drive is key. What about emotions? How do they fit in?
The article underscores that our emotions are deeply, deeply intertwined with our cognitive processes, like learning and memory. They're not separate things in the brain.
So how you feel affects how you learn.
Massively. Developing skills in emotional self-management, recognizing and regulating your own feelings, can significantly enhance your ability to learn effectively. Being too anxious or frustrated can shut down learning.
Is stress always bad for learning?
Not necessarily. The article notes that a certain level of mild stress or arousal can actually have a positive impact on memory encoding, making the initial memory stronger. Think of flashbulb memories.
Okay.
But prolonged or intense stress, especially during memory retrieval, can significantly impair your ability to recall information. Stressing out during a test is bad news for recall.
Right. And the social environment matters too.
Hugely. The article points out the significant impact of the social climate. Feeling supported, valued, safe, and part of a community in your learning environment actually reduces stress and significantly enhances motivation and overall learning outcomes. Learning is social.
So understanding these background processes, attention, motivation, emotion, social factors, it gives you a more holistic view, doesn't it?
Exactly. It helps you understand why certain strategies work and how you can create better conditions for your own learning by paying attention to these underlying factors.
Okay, so as we bring all these threads together, from sharpening the axe to understanding neuroplasticity, it becomes really clear that learning how to learn isn't just some academic exercise.
No, it's a crucial meta skill, as Ali Abgal aptly puts it. A skill that can genuinely improve your life in countless ways. Career, hobbies, personal growth, everything.
Effective learning, as we've explored through all these sources, is really a multifaceted process, isn't it? It involves,
thoughtfully preparing yourself to learn.
Actively focusing your attention.
Deeply engaging with material through things like immersion and active recall.
Seeking out and actually using regular feedback.
Striving for that deep understanding through overlearning, asking why.
Employing strategic memory techniques like spacing and mnemonics.
Even teaching others what you've learned.
And leveraging those active learning methodologies that are grounded in how our brains actually work, the neuroscience.
It's quite a combination. And the most important takeaway for you, our listener, is really to experiment. Try these things out.
Yeah, don't just listen to us talk about it.
Find the strategies that resonate most effectively with your individual learning style, the type of stuff you're trying to learn, and your specific goals. Mix and match.
This deep dive has really offered a comprehensive range of strategies, hasn't it? From those first steps of preparing your mind, all the way to harnessing your memory more effectively.
A real journey through learning how to learn.
We really encourage you to think about which one or two of these strategies you could start implementing, like today or tomorrow. Something small to enhance whatever you're currently learning.
Don't try to do everything at once. Pick one thing.
Good point. Take some time to reflect, too, on how understanding even a little bit about the workings of your own brain can empower you to become a much more efficient, engaged, and ultimately a more successful learner in the long run.
It really is empowering. Thank you so much for joining us on this pretty in-depth exploration of the fascinating world of learning strategies.
Yeah, thanks for sticking with us.
We truly hope that you found these insights to be both valuable and, more importantly, immediately actionable in your own life.
And if you enjoyed this deep dive and want to keep exploring other fascinating topics with us, please do subscribe to the English Easy Here channel wherever you're listening.
We've got lots more planned.
We have so many more insightful discussions lined up for you.
We would also absolutely love to hear from you. What effective learning techniques do you personally use? Or do you have any follow-up questions about anything we've discussed today?
Yeah, share your tips.
Please feel free to share your thoughts and experiences with us in the comments section or reach out through our website or social media. Your engagement really makes this community richer.
Absolutely. And a special thank you again to each and every one of you who stayed with us right to the very end of this deep dive. We know it was a long one.
We appreciate your time and attention.
We truly do.